She was 20 years old and penniless. After the ruin of her family and the death of her parents, Clara Whitmore was left with no prospects, no relations to take her in, and just 2 gold sovereigns to her name. With that scant sum, she bought a decaying, abandoned manor in the Sussex countryside that no one else wanted. But what nobody knew was that bricked into the damp cellar wall was a secret that would not only change her life, but redeem a name left to ruin. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from as we tell her story. Clara Whitmore's childhood had been one of quiet, bookish comfort. Lived in the sturdy brick house her father's success had afforded them in Luce. Edward Whitmore was a shipping merchant, a man whose integrity was as solid as the oak timbers of the vessels he chartered. He smelled of salt and paper and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco. His hands, though often stained with ink, were gentle. For her 10th birthday, he had given her a small, exquisitely carved guillemot from a piece of driftwood, its body smooth and weighted, a perfect fit for her palm. He had taught her the careful art of bookkeeping, showing her how the columns of figures told a story of profit and loss, of voyages successful and ventures failed. A ledger, Clara, he'd say, his voice a low rumble, is a history book of honesty. It does not lie if the hand that writes in it is true. She learned to love the clean lines, the satisfying balance of a reconciled account. Her mother, Eleanor, was a quieter presence, a woman who found her joy in the walled garden behind their house, her hands always smelling of soil and rose petals. From her, Clara learned the names of flowers and the patience required to nurture a fragile seedling into bloom. But the most formative presence in her practical education was Mrs. Gable, the family's housekeeper. A widow in her late 50s, with hands gnarled by a lifetime of work, Mrs. Gable moved through the house with an unhurried competence that was a force of nature. It was she who taught Clara the true domestic arts, not the decorative embroidery of a lady, but the essential craft of survival. She taught her how to make a hearty soup from vegetable peelings and a ham bone, how to properly bank a fire to last the night, how to mix a lye solution for soap, and how to identify, harvest, and prepare the herbs that could soothe a cough or ease a fever. Waste is a sin, Miss Clara, Mrs. Gable would say, her voice as crisp as starched linen. There's use in everything if you've the eyes to see it. She taught Clara how to mend a seam so it was stronger than the original cloth, and how to listen to the sounds of a house, the groan of a floorboard, the rattle of a window, to know what needed fixing. This education was her true inheritance, a legacy of resilience woven into the fabric of her being, far more valuable than the porcelain dolls and silk ribbons that gathered dust in her girlhood room. She carried these lessons within her, a quiet ballast against the coming storm. The storm broke not with a crash of thunder, but with the dry rustle of paper. It began the year Clara turned 19. Whispers in town grew into open gossip, talk of financial trouble at Whitmore and Croft Shipping. Her father's partner, Silas Croft, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes and a constant air of aggrieved politeness, became a frequent, tense visitor to the house. The scent of pipe tobacco was replaced by the acrid smell of anxiety. Her father grew thin, his face etched with lines of worry, the columns of his own ledgers no longer balancing. Then came the official notice of bankruptcy, the accusation of fraud leveled squarely at Edward Whitmore. Croft, it was said, had discovered the malfeasance and, with great reluctance, had been forced to expose his partner to protect the firm's investors. The ledgers, presented as evidence, were filled with her father's handwriting, detailing phantom cargoes and diverted funds. It was a story of betrayal so complete, so meticulously documented, that it was impossible to refute. Edward Whitmore, the man who believed a ledger was a history of honesty, was ruined by one. He collapsed, his heart giving way under the weight of the disgrace, and was dead within a week. The family's assets were seized to cover the debts Croft's investigation had uncovered. The house in Luce, The furniture, her mother's silver, all of it was sold. Eleanor Whitmore, adrift in a sea of grief and public shame, faded like a pressed flower, and followed her husband before the winter snows had melted. Clara was left utterly alone. The final act of her ejection was performed by Mr. Davies, the family's former solicitor, a man who now served Silas Croft. He met her in the cramped, rented room she'd taken, his face a mask of professional pity. He handed her a thin envelope. "This is the final settlement of your father's estate, Miss Whitmore," he said, avoiding her gaze. "After all creditors were satisfied, this is what remains." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a final accounting that showed a balance of £2 sterling. He placed 2 heavy gold sovereigns on the table beside the letter. They shone with a cold, indifferent light. There was no argument, no outburst. The cruelty was administrative, a simple closing of a file. Clara looked at the coins, then at the man's averted face. She did not weep. The lessons of Mrs. Gable had taught her that grief was a private thing, and survival was a practical one. She took the small wooden guillemot from her pocket, its smooth form a comfort in her palm. She gathered the few belongings she had left, a change of clothes, her mother's gardening shears, and a book of herbal remedies, and packed them into a small canvas satchel. The 2 gold coins went into a small leather purse, their weight a constant, solid reminder of the totality of her loss. She was no longer Clara Whitmore of Luce. She was just a woman with £2 and a name nobody wanted to be associated with. Her journey was not a flight, but a deliberate, solitary walk away from a life that no longer existed. She left Luce on a grey Tuesday morning in April, the air damp with the promise of more rain. She did not look back. Her direction was guided by a vague notion of putting as much distance as possible between herself and the town that held her, family's shame. She walked west, following the old coaching roads and farm tracks that crisscrossed the Sussex Weald. The first few days were a blur of motion and fatigue. She walked until her feet were blistered and her shoulders ached from the weight of her small satchel. At night she sought shelter in barns or abandoned shepherds' huts, paying a few pennies for a place on the straw if she had to, but more often finding a dry corner for free. She ate the bread and cheese she carried, supplementing it with the wild garlic and young nettles Mrs. Gable had taught her to identify along the hedgerows. The world resolved itself into a series of immediate physical sensations. The squelch of mud under her worn boots, the persistent dampness that seeped into her woolen cloak, the sharp scent of wet earth and wood smoke, the cry of a distant curlew. The landscape of the high weald unfolded around her, a rolling tapestry of ancient woodland, small enclosed fields, and deep-cut lanes or gills, thick with ferns and moss. She watched the slow, patient work of the countryside. A farmer guiding a plow behind a heavy horse, a woman spreading laundry on a hedge to dry, the steady rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer from a village forge. These were scenes of endurance, of lives lived quietly and with purpose, and they resonated with the practical resolve solidifying within her. After a week of walking, she found herself near the small, insular village of Curdford, a place nestled among orchards and oak forests. In the window of the local public house, which also served as a posting station and informal town office, a notice was tacked to the grimy glass. It was handwritten, the ink faded by the sun. For sale by auction, the property known as Blackwood Manor, to be sold as is with all faults. Unencumbered title, reserve, £2. The locals in the taproom laughed when she asked about it. The place was cursed, they said, haunted, a ruin. The last family to own it had been mired in lawsuits for a generation, and the house had been left to rot for 20 years. No one in their right mind would want it. But for Clara, the words unencumbered title and the price, the exact sum she possessed, seemed less a coincidence and more a sign. It was a place with no history anyone wanted, a perfect match for a woman with a name she needed to escape. The auction was a formality, held on the steps of the village church. She was the only bidder. The auctioneer, a portly man who doubled as the publican, barely hid his amusement as he took her 2 gold sovereigns. He handed her a yellowed deed, the wax seal cracked and dusty. "She's all yours, miss," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Mind the ghosts." Clara simply folded the paper, placed it in her satchel, and walked out of the village towards her new, ruined home. Blackwood Manor stood at the end of a long, overgrown lane, half hidden by a stand of ancient yew trees. It was not a grand palace, but a small, severe Jacobean house, built of dark, local sandstone that was stained nearly black by centuries of rain and lichen. Its face was grim, with mullioned windows like vacant eyes, many of them boarded up or shattered. A section of the slate roof had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole open to the sky, and ivy had forced its way through the mortar, its thick, hairy fingers prying stones apart. The front door, heavy oak studded with iron nails, hung crookedly on one hinge. The property comprised the house itself, a collection of crumbling outbuildings, a stable, a brewhouse, a dovecote, and about 3 acres of land, now a wilderness of brambles, nettles, and self-seeded saplings. A low stone wall, breached in several places, marked the perimeter. It was a picture of profound and absolute decay. Yet Clara, standing before it with the deed in her hand, felt not despair but a flicker of something else. She saw the good stone, the sturdy bones of the structure that had survived 2 centuries of neglect. She saw the south-facing slope of the land, perfect for a garden. Mrs. Gable's voice echoed in her mind. "There's use in everything, if you've the eyes to see it." She pushed open the groaning door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster, rotting wood, and the musty decay of generations. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. The entrance hall was flagged with stone, coated in a slick of green algae. A grand staircase, its balustrade intricately carved but half-eaten by woodworm, rose into the shadows of the upper floor. To her left was a drawing room where strips of silk wallpaper, once a vibrant floral pattern, now hung in peeling, faded ribbons, revealing the lath and plaster beneath. A fireplace large enough to stand in was choked with fallen masonry and birds' nests. To her right, a dining room held the ghost of a table, a dark rectangle on the floor where it had once stood, surrounded by the faint outlines of chairs. Everything of value had been stripped out long ago. She moved through the ground floor, room by silent, decaying room. The library's shelves were bare, warped by damp. The kitchens were a nightmare of rust and grime, the great iron range a crumbling wreck. But in a small back scullery, she found a hand pump over a stone sink. With a grunt of effort, she worked the handle up and down, and after a dozen rasping, dry strokes, a trickle of brown water sputtered from the spout, slowly clearing to a steady, clean stream. It was the first sign of life. Her survey ended in the cellar, accessed by a set of steep stone steps. The air down here was cold and smelled of wet earth and fungus. It was a series of vaulted brick chambers used for storing wine and provisions. Most of the walls were slick with moisture, but one chamber, at the very back, seemed drier than the rest. It was here, as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, that she noticed something amiss. While the other walls were constructed of old, dark, handmade bricks, one entire section of the rear wall was different. The bricks were a slightly paler red, their edges sharper, and the mortar between them was a lighter gray, clearly of a more recent vintage. It was a patch, a clumsy, obvious repair that covered an area roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Someone at some point had bricked something in. For 3 days, Clara worked to make a small section of the house habitable. She chose a small servant's room on the ground floor, one with an intact window and a small fireplace. She swept out the thick carpet of dust and debris, scrubbed the floorboards with water from the scullery pump, and used old sacking she found in the stable to block the worst of the drafts. She gathered fallen branches for firewood, and after clearing a generation of nests from the flue, managed to coax a smoky, sputtering fire to life. It was a small victory, but the warmth it cast was a bulwark against the oppressive chill of the house. All the while, the image of the bricked-up wall in the cellar remained fixed in her mind. It was a puzzle, an anomaly in a house full of straightforward decay. On the fourth day, armed with a cold chisel and a heavy mallet she'd found in the derelict forge, she went down into the cold dark. She started at the top of the strange section, tapping at the mortar. It was softer than the surrounding old lime mortar, more like a modern cement mix. She placed the point of the chisel into a join and struck it firmly with the mallet. A chip of mortar flew off. Encouraged, she worked methodically, chipping away the joins around a single brick. It took nearly an hour of patient, jarring labor before the brick was loose enough to wiggle. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. It came free with a grating sound, heavy and cold in her hands. She peered into the dark hole, but could see nothing. She set the brick aside and started on the next one. The work was slow and exhausting. Her arms and back ached, and the rhythmic chink, chink, chink of the chisel on stone was the only sound in the silent house. Brick by brick, a dark void began to open in the wall. When she had removed a section large enough to see into, she held her single candle up to the opening. Beyond the wall was a small, dry cavity, a purpose-built space no larger than a cupboard, and inside, resting on the stone floor, was a small, iron-bound chest. It was about 2 feet long and a foot deep, its wood dark and its iron straps showing only a light bloom of rust. A heavy, intricate lock secured it. A surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and wild hope, coursed through her. She worked faster now, her movements fueled by a frantic energy, pulling out bricks until the opening was large enough to drag the chest through. It was heavier than it looked. With a final desperate heave, she pulled it out of the wall and onto the cellar floor. The lock was old and robust. There was no breaking it, but the hinges on the back were simpler, held by large iron screws. Using the chisel as a lever and the mallet as a hammer, she began the painstaking process of forcing the rusted screws. One by one, they groaned and gave way. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the lid broke free. She lifted it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay the contents. On top was a small, heavy leather pouch, which clinked with the unmistakable sound of coin. Beneath it, a small collection of jewelry, a pearl necklace, a pair of garnet earrings, a simple gold brooch, and under that a large packet wrapped in oilskin and tied securely with waxed cord. Beside the packet lay a small, tarnished silver locket. With trembling hands, Clara lifted the oilskin bundle. She untied the cord and unfolded the stiff, waterproofed cloth. Inside were 2 things, a stack of paper and a letter. The letter was addressed in a neat, spidery hand, "To whomever finds this." She opened it. The handwriting was precise, the words of a man accustomed to careful record-keeping. It began, "My name is Alistair Finch. I was, for 17 years, the head clerk for Whitmore and Croft Shipping. I am sealing this away in the year of our Lord 1853. Knowing my own time is short, I write this to set a great wrong to rights." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The letter went on to detail, with meticulous and damning precision, how Silas Croft had systematically defrauded his own company over a period of 5 years. He had created a second set of ledgers, forcing a junior clerk to forge Edward Whitmore's hand, while he himself siphoned off profits into a secret account. The papers bundled with the letter were the original ledger pages Finch had managed to rescue from the fire where Croft had tried to destroy all evidence, pages that showed the true, honest accounts of the firm. It named the junior clerk and described how Croft had paid for his passage to America to ensure his silence. Finch explained that he himself had been cheated by Croft and dismissed when he began to suspect the truth. Terminally ill and with no family, he had used his last savings to buy this derelict house. a place to die in peace, and had hidden the proof, along with his own small life savings, in the wall. Mr. Whitmore was a good and honest man, the final paragraph read. He did not deserve the ruin that villain brought upon him. I pray that this evidence finds its way into the hands of someone with the courage to use it. The silver locket was my daughter's. She died young. Perhaps it will bring some small comfort to the next soul who finds this place a refuge. Clara sank back against the cold cellar wall, the letter in one hand, the proof of her father's innocence in the other. Tears she had refused to shed for a year finally came, silent and hot, not of grief, but of a fierce, burning vindication. The first light of dawn found Clara not sleeping, but sitting at a makeshift table in her small, clean room, the contents of the chest laid out before her. The pouch contained 57 gold sovereigns. It was a fortune, a sum beyond her wildest imaginings, just a day before, but its value paled in comparison to the papers spread across the wood. The ledger pages, filled with her father's true, neat hand and Alistair Finch's clear, damning testimony. Her first task was not to dream of riches, but to plan. Her father's lessons in bookkeeping, long dormant, now came to the fore. She took a blank page and drew up a new ledger. Blackwood Manor, account of restoration. On one side she listed her assets, 57 sovereigns. On the other she began a list of necessities. The first entry was roof. She spent the next day walking the 5 miles to the market town of Petworth, her step lighter than it had been in a year. She sought out not a grand solicitor, but a small independent one whose shingle read, Mr. Elias Vance, Solicitor and Commissioner for Oaths. He was an elderly man with kind, tired eyes, who listened to her story without interruption, his fingertips steepled together. He examined the ledger pages and Finch's letter, his expression growing graver with each page he turned. When he was finished, he looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "This is formidable, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is more than an accusation. This is proof. Pursuing this will be a battle, but it is a battle that can be won." For the first time, Clara felt she was not alone. She left the legal fight in his capable hands and returned to Blackwood, her focus turning to the physical resurrection of the house. She found the local tiler, a man named Jacob Ames, in the village pub. He was a gnarled, wiry man in his 60s, with a reputation for being surly but honest. He listened to her request to repair the roof, his expression skeptical. "That's a big job for a place like Blackwood," he grumbled, "and for a slip of a girl to be commissioning." Clara did not argue or plead. She simply said, "I can pay for the slates and for your time. I will help with the labor where I can." He looked at her clear, steady gaze, at her work-ruined hands, and saw not a slip of a girl, but someone of substance. He grunted, "I'll come and look at it tomorrow." He did, and the day after he arrived with his wagon, his ladders and his tools. The work began. Clara proved true to her word, hauling slates up the ladder, clearing away the rotten timbers, and learning to mix the mortar. Ames, gruff at first, slowly warmed to her, showing her how to properly seat a slate, how to nail it so it wouldn't crack. While the roof was being mended, Clara turned her attention to the garden. She attacked the wilderness of brambles and nettles with her mother's shears and a billhook she bought in the village. It was backbreaking work. She cleared a patch of the south-facing slope, turning over the rich, dark soil that had lain fallow for decades. An older woman from the village, Elspeth Hemlock, stopped by the broken wall one afternoon, watching her work. "You're clearing the devil's garden," she said, her voice raspy. Clara, leaning on her spade, simply nodded. "I hope to plant a better one." Mrs. Hemlock pointed with a bony finger. "That's good ground for potatoes. And over there, by the wall, that's where you'll want your herbs. The old stones hold the heat." The next day, she returned with a basket containing a handful of seed potatoes and a bundle of cuttings from her own garden, rosemary, thyme, and sage. She didn't say much, but her gift was an act of acceptance, a root put down in the community's soil. The community began to arrive, one by one, drawn by curiosity and the sight of work being done. Thomas Green, a young carpenter with quiet hands and a shy smile, came to offer his services to repair the window frames and hang the front door properly. He spoke little, but his work was precise and beautiful. He took his payment, but the next day his young son arrived on the doorstep with a basket of fresh eggs. Slowly, brick by brick, slate by slate, seed by seed, Blackwood Manor and Clara Whitmore were being rebuilt together. The rhythm of life at Blackwood Manor settled into one of patient, steady work. The seasons turned, and with them, the house slowly shed its skin of dereliction. After Mr. Ames finished the roof, the house was finally dry for the first time in a generation. The oppressive dampness receded, replaced by the clean scent of drying plaster and fresh sawn wood. Thomas Green worked his way through the house, room by room, reglazing windows, repairing floorboards and unjamming doors that had been sealed shut for decades. Clara worked alongside him, learning to mix plaster and apply it in smooth, even coats, her movements becoming sure and practiced. She whitewashed the walls of the downstairs rooms, and the oppressive gloom was banished, replaced by a bright, airy peace. The great fireplaces were cleared, and their chimneys swept, and soon cheerful fires crackled in the drawing room and the kitchen, their warmth pushing back the last of the chill. The house began to breathe again. Her name became known in the village, not as the disgraced daughter of a ruined merchant, but as the mistress of Blackwood. People no longer smirked at the mention of the house. They spoke of the smoke rising from its chimneys and the light in its windows at night. Small rituals began to form, weaving her into the fabric of the community. Every Tuesday she would walk into Curdford for market day, her basket filled with the herbs and vegetables from her flourishing garden. She traded her surplus rosemary and thyme with the baker for a loaf of bread, her potatoes with the butcher for a piece of bacon. Mrs. Hemlock became a regular visitor, bringing news from the village and sharing her vast knowledge of foraging and preserving. They would sit together in the newly restored kitchen, shelling peas or stringing beans for drying, their comfortable silence a testament to a friendship that needed few words. Thomas Green, having finished the essential carpentry, continued to come by once a week, bringing his son to help in the garden, ostensibly to check on his work, but really just to share a cup of tea and a slice of Clara's seed cake. He taught her how to properly sharpen her tools, and she showed him which herbs could be made into a poultice for his son's scraped knee. Blackwood Manor was no longer a burden or a ruin. It had become a living place, a refuge that now offered refuge to others. The grand, decaying rooms were still largely empty, but the parts of the house she inhabited were filled with purpose and warmth. The unwanted property, bought in desperation, had transformed into a home, a livelihood, and a source of quiet earned authority. Meanwhile, in Petworth, Mr. Vance's work was proceeding. He had located the junior clerk, who had been living in poverty and fear in Boston. Faced with Alistair Finch's signed statement, the man gave a full confession of his role in Silas Croft's scheme. Armed with this and the original ledger pages, Mr. Vance filed a suit that sent shockwaves through the merchant houses of Sussex. Silas Croft, now a wealthy and respected figure, was exposed as a common thief and a fraud. His empire, built on lies, crumbled as quickly as it had been built. One crisp October afternoon, a year and a half after she had arrived at its broken door, Clara stood in the newly restored study of Blackwood Manor. The room smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the wood smoke from the small fire crackling on the hearth. Sunlight streamed through the clean, leaded glass of the window, illuminating the rich grain of the oak paneling that Thomas Green had so carefully repaired and polished. This was the room where she now managed the estate's accounts, her ledgers as clean and honest as her father had taught her they should be. The day before, Mr. Vance had visited, bringing the final papers. Silas Croft was in prison. What could be salvaged of her father's assets, a modest sum but significant, had been restored to her. More importantly, his name had been officially and publicly cleared. The newspapers that had once condemned him now printed apologies and retractions. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud had finally been lifted. On the desk, polished to a deep luster, sat two small objects side by side. One was the wooden guillemot her father had carved for her, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of her hand during her darkest days. The other was the small, tarnished silver locket left by Alistair Finch. She had cleaned it carefully, and inside it was empty, a space waiting to be filled. She had not opened it to put anything inside, respecting it as a memorial to a stranger's lost daughter, a symbol of a grief that had in its own way given her back her life. These two objects, one from the father who had loved her, and one from the stranger who had saved her, told the whole story. They were testaments to quiet integrity, to love, and to the strange, unseen threads that connect one life to another across time. She thought of Mrs. Gable, the practical, no-nonsense housekeeper who had armed her for this life without ever knowing it. She thought of the people who had underestimated her, the smirking auctioneer, the condescending solicitor, the gossips in loos. They saw a ruined girl, an object of pity or scorn. They had not seen the strength forged in her, the ability to see value where they saw only decay. They could not have imagined this outcome. A woman, whole and self-sufficient, the quiet mistress of her own domain. She was Clara Whitmore of Blackwood Manor, a name she had built for herself, slate by slate and brick by brick. Clara Whitmore was 20 years old and penniless when she arrived in Curdford. She had 2 gold sovereigns to her name, and she spent them on an abandoned, ruined house that everyone said was worthless. It was the best £2 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and quiet vindication. If you've ever found unexpected strength in a moment of loss, or seen value in something others have cast aside, share your story in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And for more stories of hidden histories and lives rebuilt, be sure to subscribe and stay close to our channel.